Lo, for this dark terrestrial ball forsakes his azure-paved hall.
When we think of Black Georgians, the primary image which comes to mind is that of the enslaved African child. What this exhibition seeks to do is to sort of challenge that by showing, by demonstrating that there was a spectrum of people who lived there, people from a variety of backgrounds, a variety of ethnic origins, and people who were involved in a variety of activities, a spectrum of activities ranging from, obviously, a large number who were in some state of bondage, others who were part of the British Armed Forces, either the Royal Navy or the Army or the Merchant Services, and yet others who were leading apparently normal, everyday, workaday lives. We're talking about upwards or up to at least 15,000 people all over the British Isles. The African Academy is one of the more unusual institutions in Georgian London. It was founded in 1799 by members of the Sierra Leone Company, as well as some of the great and good who lived around Clapham, some members of the Clapham sect, the most prominent abolitionist group in the British Isles, which involved, of course, people like William Wilberforce, the Venns, the Thorntons, etc., the great and the good, who founded this school as a way of attracting the children from the leading families of Sierra Leone to be schooled and indoctrinated in the British way of life and Christianity, etc. What's fascinating about this part of the exhibition is that we can see a scan here of baptisms in the parish of Clapham from the year 1805. And it's very clear that some of these individuals had extraordinary lives. They came from extraordinary families because, of course, at this period, Sierra Leone is in some ways a microcosm of the African diaspora. Hence, you find individuals like the Corker family, or the Coker family, as they're now better known, who are sons of Stephen Coker, who's a proprietor of the Banana Islands and the Plantain Islands near Sierra Leone. You have people who come from indigenous families of the area, such as Naminamadu, who is chief of the Port Logo in the Temini country. You have Thomas Smith, who is the son of Andrew Smith, who is a Maroon from Jamaica. You have others, such as the Cazelles, who have come from originally from North America, from Nova Scotia, where they were born, and of course they made the journey across the Atlantic to Sierra Leone. All of these families are sending their sons to the African Academy. There were 20 boys and 4 girls, I believe, who were educated at this institution. Firstly, it was on Clapham Common, then on Rectory Grove. This is a portrait of Phyllis Wheatley, the most famous depiction of Phyllis Wheatley, who was the first black published poet in English that we're aware of. She had been born, we believe, in 1753 in the Senegambia region, from when she was taken as a child. She became, or was made, an enslaved servant to Mr. John Wheatley of Boston. John Wheatley was a Boston lawyer who unusually permitted Phyllis Wheatley, who was his property, to educate herself, to read, to learn Greek, to learn Latin, probably as an experiment, probably as an amusement for himself and his friends. Phyllis, however, proved a very eager student, a gifted student, and she took to writing poetry, creating poems of all sorts. In 1771, she came with the Wheatley family to the British Isles. She came to London, and 2 years later, her first book of poems, poems on subjects religious and moral, was published. Unfortunately for Phyllis, she found herself being used as a political football between both the abolitionist side, who saw her as an example of African humanity worthy to be preserved. These are people just like us who are capable of thought and writing Latin odes. And she was also used as a football by the pro-slavery lobby, who of course saw the fact that she'd been taken from the African gloom and she had been educated, that the light of European education had shone upon her. It was seen as a good thing. This is an engraving of Ignatius Sancho. Ignatius Sancho was one of the more prominent black Georgians, in as much as here we have him as he's depicted by Bartolozzi in the famous etching. Here is someone who, at the time of the rendering of this portrait, was a shopkeeper. He was a correspondent to the great and the good. He was at the epicenter of the artistic and cultural whirl of Georgian London. Yet he had been born, according to his account, on a slave ship. He was brought to this country at the age of 2, maybe 3 years of age, and there's no nice way of saying it, he was put into the house of 3 elderly ladies in Greenwich as a living, breathing objet d'art, a pet, basically. The resident in the neighboring property was the Duke of Montagu, who took a shine to the young African and permitted him to enjoy the property, Montagu House, as well as the library at Montagu House. The young Sancho eventually joined the household, the Montagu household, as a butler, where he continued his studies. And eventually we see him in central London, in Charles Street, 1 block down from the Houses of Parliament, 1 block down from Downing Street, where he has opened a grocer's shop. This grocer's shop actually is selling largely, it seems, the produce of enslaved labor: tobacco, molasses, sugarcane, rum. He wrote that to the English, we, black people, we are all either mulish or foolish, without exception. And more tellingly, in another piece of correspondence, he writes that I am only a lodger here, and hardly that. So here is someone who's very, very aware of his separateness from general English society, even though he's someone who has done very well. He's a business person, he's a family man, he can vote because he owns property at a time when more than 95% of the population didn't have the right. This is a bust of Alauda Equiano by Christy Symington, the sculptor Christy Symington. Equiano, again, is one of the more prominent black Georgians. He is generally described as the first political leader of Britain's black community. We have someone, in the case of Equiano, who was, as many black Georgians were, taken from the African continent at a young age. He survived the Middle Passage. He was sold and resold severally throughout the Caribbean and North America. At a very young age, he finds himself as a young serviceman on board Royal Navy vessels. He manages to purchase his own freedom and settles in London, where he becomes probably the face of the black abolitionist movement. And it's very important that Equiano is remembered in this light as a black abolitionist, because such there were. Equiano and others such as Ibaka Guano were part of a lobby group who collectively signed themselves the Sons of Africa. And of course they were pushing for the abolition of the slave trade, but they were also lobbying to improve civil rights and conditions for people of African origin resident in Britain. So he's a very, very significant person, someone who also brought us to the best of our knowledge, the first account of being transported as human cargo across the Atlantic in a slave ship. Very, very harrowing account of being captured and being taken across the Atlantic as human cargo. And this is the first time that we're seeing in English these sorts of accounts coming from African people. Writers like Equiano were so influential because they were introducing African thought to a majority white British readership for the first time. This exhibition isn't simply a gallery of the great and the good. It is important to remember that as well as the Equianos and the Dido Bells and the Cugoanos, we also have to address the fact that a large number of Black Georgians were either in service of one sort or another or in one or another state of enslavement. These are extraordinary stories, a lot of which we get from the newspapers of the period. Here we have one person, Neptune, described as a Negro, about 15 years of age, and a stout fellow who has decided in the middle of the winter, in November, to run away. Similarly, we have another Negro servant named Gloucester who has run away in Chippenham. Fascinatingly, here we have a deserter, one of a number of Black soldiers and sailors who deserted. This particular individual went by the name of Thomas Williams, and he was a musician with the 4th Regiment of Dragoons, and he has also run away. He's 5 feet 10 inches high, his face very black, and there's a 20 shillings reward for him as well. But such notices were very, very common in the newspapers of the period, and they just show us the degree of resistance to enslavement that people in the most wretched conditions undertook. These are documents relating to the swearing in of one Nathaniel Wells as the Sheriff of Monmouthshire in 1818. What's interesting is that the new Sheriff of the County of Monmouthshire in 1818 was a man of African origin. He had one Black parent who was an enslaved woman on the island of St. Kitts, and one white parent who owned his mother. Clearly, Nathaniel Wells was a favored child, but he wasn't in any way unusual. There are a number of children of such unions between enslaved and slaver who luckily found themselves in the position of being favored children, and they were sent possibly for reasons of embarrassment, possibly because they were favored children, they were sent to the British Isles for an education. Nathaniel was especially favored. He found himself at the age of 21 with an apartment in Pall Mall and a very large sum of money settled on him. He married the daughter of the chaplain to the royal family, and very soon found himself ensconced in Piercefield Hall, one of the largest, if not the largest, property in South Wales, basically by a large part of what's now Chepstow Racecourse, as a very, very wealthy individual. His wealth increased and was compounded in the 1830s when he found himself the beneficiary of money which was given in compensation to slave owners for the loss of their human property. We have to remember that Nathaniel Wells was, even though he was the product of the processes of enslavement, he was still an owner of enslaved people. One of the people who he owned was his own mother, for the release of which he received money. This image from 1742 gives us what is possibly the only depiction of one of the more fascinating African writers from the Georgian period. This gentleman, supposedly Ibaka Guano, and here he is depicted with these two people the man and the woman who are believed to be the causeway, the causeways. The causeways were society painters, and here they are. Well, Richard Causeway is depicting himself and his wife being waited on by their servant Ibaka Guano, or as he was more popularly known to the English, John Stewart, his anglicised name. Ibaka Guano is a fascinating writer because, like Equiano, he had been taken from Africa at a young age. He finds himself in this country working as a servant in Pall Mall for the Causeways, and he becomes involved in the abolition movement. He joins the Sons of Africa, a black lobby group, and he also writes. He produces an extraordinary book, Thoughts and Sentiments on the Evil and Wicked Traffic of the Slavery, which takes an economic perspective on enslavement. It looks at the money that Africa is losing. It looks at them through enslavement. It looks at the human resources that Africa is losing. And Cugoano is most important for putting on the table the idea of reparations. And he stresses that Britain, because it is the leading trader in human lives, should be the leading contributor and the first to set an example as far as offering and implementing reparations to African countries goes. So he's a revolutionary in many ways, and it's another approach to abolition, which hasn't really been studied in enough detail. In 1787, more than 300 black men and women were removed from the streets of London. More than 300 of London's black poor, as they were called, destitute people of African origin, supposedly, were removed from the streets of London and dumped in Sierra Leone, West Africa. What's fascinating about so many of them was that they were, to a significant degree, former soldiers and former sailors in the British Armed Forces, many of whom had served in Britain's campaigns in North America. Of course, as those campaigns collapsed, so many of these black loyalists, as some style them, moved, some to Canada, but a great many to the British Isles as well, where they found themselves swelling the ranks of the capital's black poor population. Many of them were unskilled. Some of them brought their families with them. They were seen, as reports attest, to be intruding upon the observation of London's great and good, the Gilded Set. The idea was put forward that they should be removed to Sierra Leone in West Africa, a place where very few, if any of them, had any connections, or of which they had very little knowledge. But here we see some of their names. There were 3 vessels drawn up for their transportation: the Atlantic, the Vernon, and the Belisarius, docked in Deptford. The person who was put in charge of their provisioning was none other than Alauda Equiano, making him the first civil servant, I imagine. But here are their names, and we can see they are overwhelmingly anglicized names. The family names: Thomas, Lewis, Hall, Johnson, Hartford, Truman. Fascinatingly, we see in this document that note is made in one column of black women who are married to white men, and in the other column we have a list of white women who are married to black men, raising the question: were these couples leaving because of discomfort that their relationships caused here, or were their relationships something which was very common and accepted in the British Isles? But the fact that they are leaving as couples really prompts consideration of all sorts of topics around the subject of mixed marriages, which their very presence would have engendered in the 18th century. One of the most striking features of this period is the rise in literacy. More people are writing, more people are reading. There's a spread of ideas of all sorts. One of these is the nature of man, the nature of humanity. There are all sorts of ideas about liberty, equality, and fraternity, obviously on the other side of the Atlantic. It's a time of intense debate about what it means to be a human being. And in the midst of this, you have the enslaved African. What position does the enslaved African play? For example, the words of Robert Wedderburn. Robert Wedderburn, who was born of an enslaved mother in Jamaica. He was a sailor. He was probably the foremost black radical of the Georgian period, who was a firebrand. He was a true radical. His words here say it all, more than any preface I could offer could. Let us rise up then, brethren, let us rise, not with petitions and marches, but with action. For it is demeaning to human nature to petition our oppressors. We need revolution, not reform. As well as the insights that Ignatius Quiana offered in regards to the human condition under enslavement, we have the insights offered from a female perspective. The woman's words, in this case, being those of Mary Prince. She was an enslaved woman, a formerly enslaved woman, who found herself in London and deliver an account of her experiences, which, of course, in many ways were more severe than those that a lot of men suffered. I was soon surrounded by strange men who examined and handled me in the same manner that a butcher would a calf or a lamb he was about to purchase, and who talked about my shape and size in like words, as if I could no more understand their meaning than the dumb beasts. I was then put up to sale.
Lo, for this dark terrestrial ball forsakes his azure-paved hall.